Go right. Good morning, Keith.
Morning, Claire.
So thank you for joining me this morning. So I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may, about advocacy and your role in being an advocate. So just to kick off, I'd like to ask you, what do you understand by the term advocacy?
I think that the term advocacy has a number of different layers to it, actually. I think there is a role for giving a voice to the people that you're working with. In my situation, it's young people, so I kind of probably refer to those people as young people throughout. So it's giving a voice to young people, first and foremost, finding mechanisms, enabling them to talk about their wishes and feelings and aspirations. And that could mean in a whole set of contexts, really, right from individual meetings that they're involved in, right through to them being part of the planning and delivery of an evaluation of services. So that kind of sort of feeds into another agenda, which is really around participation, which is a word that students might hear. So there's at one level, there's giving young people a voice, but I think that there's another level as well, and that's being a voice for young people too. So it's about speaking up on their behalf. Now that might be in ways that because you've sat with them in advance of something and they've talked to you about what it is they want, and then you go and talk for them on their behalf. Or it might be a wider set of issues which are underpinned by this idea of children's rights. So I might advocate for children based on a whole principle of children's rights. So their right to an education, their right to having a family life, all of those things that are underpinned by that sort of children's rights and that human rights agenda. So I may well go and argue with people on those set of principles. Now I might do that individually on behalf of a young person, or I might raise that issue more broadly to bring into focus for other people who aren't even involved with that particular group of young people, to say, here's a particular issue. It's kind of important that you're aware of this for when you encounter this within your professional practice. So I think for me, advocacies, and I can give you some examples of that maybe a little bit later on anyway. But for me, I think advocacy is giving voice and being a voice to people who are often silenced.
Is advocacy different to campaigning then?
There's an umbrella here. Let me explain what I mean. I'm not like imagining an umbrella here. I think that one of them sits underneath the other as a broader issue. So I think advocacy would be your kind of umbrella thing, and then campaigning might be one of the activities under which that kind of sits. So I think advocacy, as I said, it kind of takes place in many forms. So yeah, I think there's crossover. But as I said, I think advocacy is that kind of overarching activity of broadly giving voice to people who are typically voiceless.
What do you see as being the role of an advocate, or even a successful advocate?
I think advocates take many different shapes and forms. So I might, for example, be an advocate, and that's a legal term often you might hear in the courts, where someone is an advocate, and that's usually a solicitor or a barrister that is a defendant's advocate. They are going and defending them. They are speaking on their behalf. They're being their voice. So broadly speaking, advocacy can encapsulate a whole bunch of different roles. So there's the kind of very legal advocacy. There might be a role for advocacy. There are particular groups of children within society who have a legal right to an advocate, as and when they need them. So for example, children with disability have that advocacy right. Children who are in care also have the legal right to an advocate. And that would often be an independent person who would meet, they're kind of like a professional advocate. They would meet with a young person, listen to what they've got to say, and then go into meetings, for example, with that young person and be their voice. So there's that kind of form of advocacy. So those two I've described are more formal, I would suggest. But anyone could, and I would argue should, be an advocate for children and young people in whatever role. So if I was working, as I have done in the past, in a housing project for young homeless people, I would, as a housing support worker, then I would say that if my intention is to give voice to young people, enable them to be heard, to campaign on their behalf, to campaign on wider issues, then that would be me being an advocate within that role. And more latterly, within my kind of fostering journey, I found myself being an advocate quite a lot as a foster dad, not only for my own children, but as I said earlier, raising that wider kind of set of issues to bring it to other people's attention. But I would even go so far as to say that my role at the university is that of an advocate. So in my teaching to students, I think, a significant chunk of my role is to instill in students the importance of treating young people with compassion, humanity, dignity, being empathic, acting with integrity, all of those things that young people deserve under that kind of human rights agenda. So therefore, I would say that my role within the university teaching students would also, I could argue, is a form of advocacy as well.
Okay, you kind of touched on the next question. So I was going to say, do you see yourself as an advocate? And if so, for whom?
When I said earlier about this idea of giving voice to people who don't have a voice, and that's often people who are at the wrong end of the social divide, at the excluded end of the social divide, people who experience exclusion. And throughout my career, I've worked in disability, in learning disability, where often young people don't have a voice. So that's an area that I'm particularly passionate about. Homelessness, again, giving voice to people who are homeless, campaigning on their behalf would be something I've kind of still sort of maintained a foothold in. And then more latterly, children and young people with care experience. And actually, indeed, not just young people and children, but adults with care experience too. And then more broadly, I think, all children and young people, because as I said earlier, my whole philosophy is framed within this children's rights agenda, the fact that we should be seeing children as people with rights as opposed to people with problems that need fixing. So quite a lot of people, I would say, I do have and would advocate for.
How did it come about, this idea of advocating for these young people? There are lots of people out there that have got a similar work experience to yourself, having worked with young people or homeless, but probably wouldn't class themselves as being an advocate. What's the difference, therefore, for you and your own experience in terms of just working with these people and almost stepping up to the plate and being the voice for them. What was it for you that thought, I need to do this?
I'm a bit of a gobshite.
No, really?
No, seriously. And people will find that really hard to believe, incredibly difficult to believe. So I think there's something with no one's complaining about that statement. I think there's something within my DNA, if you like. There's something within my nature that has always been quite outspoken, even as a young person at school. You know, if kids were being bullied at school, I'd go and ask the bullies politely to stop, which resulted in me getting a proper kicking one evening, actually, when I was out in town, and I kind of turned a corner and saw the bully and all his mates, and I thought, oh, hey up, I don't know what's going to go on here. And yeah, it did. I go, all right, I'll kick it for it. So I think I've always been a bit of a gobshite, to be honest with you. And from a very young age, I sort of became aware that young people in particular were kind of the subject of a whole set of injustices, if you like. So I think there was something about my kind of gobbiness, something about then this sort of awakening around injustice. And then the sort of the work I ended up doing, all of those things kind of came together, perhaps by complete accident in many respects. But I think it's very much about, again, advocacy is about an approach to working more than, I would say. Others may take a very different view, but I think it's an approach. It's about saying, well, you know, what is it that this person wants here? How can I fight with them? And the with is really important, actually. I mean, it's worth pointing out, isn't it, that the program that the students are studying is called Working with Children, Young People and Families. And the word with is really important. It's often the word that gets forgotten. But within that, there's an assumption of partnership, working with people, doing things with them. So advocacy it can be a bit of a fine line between doing stuff on their behalf, which potentially could become disempowering, and we don't want to do that. We want to give young people a voice, but we also want to enable young people to use their own voice as well. But that is often a process, which also means kind of breaking down some of those barriers that make it difficult for young people to be given a voice, and also to be given a voice in a non-tokenistic way. Often we see organisations that engage with young people. They have young people's panels. They have sort of student councils, all this stuff, where they can tick a box and say, "Oh, look, we've got young people involved," but we have to ask carefully about whether that's a meaningful involvement or not. So I think there's work to be done with adults. I think as much work to be done with adults to get them to change their perceptions of young people as there is with the young people to get their voices heard in the first place. And I've completely forgotten what your question was, Claire.
It was about how the role came about for you in terms of how, you know, what your own sort of life experiences was that have led you to being this advocate for the several groups of people that you've already said, and you have answered that. And it also leads nicely into my next question about how do you advocate? What sorts of activities do you undertake, and why, in terms of, you know, in being able to do your advocacy role?
Well, so more latterly, I think it's probably worth talking about me being a foster dad, really, because there's got some more sort of tangible things to think about. So for children who aren't in care, often it's the role of the parent to advocate for and fight for what their children need. That's what any good parent would do. That said, there are some parents who don't do that, and it's not because they're not good parents, it's because they don't have the power to speak out either, because they're silenced too. So I don't want people to go away thinking that good parents speak out and bad parents don't. Actually, I think there are lots of parents themselves that are equally voiceless and excluded as well within the systems that we've developed around children and young people. But as a parent, the ideal is that they're able to speak out, and because children who are in care and the parents are legally typically the local authority itself, so the local council that they're in, and that then gets delegated to us as foster parents, basically. So I've kind of taken on that role, but then there's that additional layer, because I've been delegated the role of being a parent on the day-to-day, but the local authority is also the legal parent, and sometimes I find myself having to argue with them, their own legal parent, and I'm like the foster parent. It's a bit complex. So a number of examples really where we've found that issues have arisen that have just kind of needed to sort, and no one else has really been willing to do it. So for example, our foster daughter came to us a few years ago, actually nearly 7 years ago actually, and she came having been in other fostering families in the past, and one of the things that we should do is save some money, put some money aside every week, so that when she's 18 she can have a big lump sum. Her savings that she'd had before coming to us weren't there, they'd gone missing, and it took us 4 years of fighting to get those savings returned, and because no one else could be asked really, so we and that involved making all sorts of complaints and bringing it up at all sorts of meetings and lots of stuff like that. Another example is where our foster boy joined us when he was 15. He was just about to come into the last year of his schooling, and so he moved into the area where we live, so had changed schools, and no one really wanted him in the schools. And we know that children in care often wait a tremendously long time to enter education. Often, there was a report a few years ago that found that children in care often waiting up to 11 months in order to have a school place. And I sensed that was going to sort of happen this way. And it's worth bearing in mind, again, from that human rights point of view, the Human Rights Act 1998 says that all children have the right to an education, and that's including looked after children. So I went and essentially badgered the head teacher of the local school, and eventually persuaded him to let our foster boy go. I then used that as then a platform for a wider sort of mini campaign really, which just to kind of raise the issue really around other practitioners, make them aware of what they need to do, and crucially make foster carers aware of how they can actually be an advocate, because not all foster carers are as resourced as I am. At the end of the day, I teach in a university which scares lots of people. So that gives me quite a lot of capital. I'm sure you've learned about Bourdieu's ideas of different capitals. Well, I've kind of got quite a lot of social capital. I've got connections. I can speak to people in my work that enables me to get information that others may not have. I have cultural capital, just that whole weight of, I've got letters after my name, and I'm not afraid to use them. So I've often written emails, stinky emails, where I use my letters after my name, which I don't do at Newman. I've never felt the need to do that, but within fostering. So it's just kind of using all of the tricks and the capital. I know that you'll ask me later on about some of those other things. There are things like getting national insurance numbers for our foster children. When you turn 16, you just get a national insurance number through the post. That doesn't happen if you're a looked after child. There's this kind of weird process that often means that children slip through the net. So I spent quite a long time supporting our foster daughter to get her national insurance number through, which also involved me writing to my local MP, raising it as an issue, because it seems to me like there's a systemic issue. And we've talked in previous modules about Thompson's PCS analysis, for example, where you have to tackle things at a personal level, at a cultural level, and at a structural level. And I think the same is the case for advocacy as well. Sometimes you have to think there are some wider structural issues here that need addressing too. So loads of examples of how I've had to, unfortunately, and all of those things, actually, those 3 examples, I think it was 3 examples I shared with you, were all completely unnecessary. It should never have required me to get involved in the first place. These are barriers, unnecessary barriers that children in care face that other children don't. And that speaks to my earlier question around that sort of social justice issue, really. I wouldn't have to be an advocate if people weren't being disadvantaged.
So thinking about being an advocate for foster care, children with care experience, or even the foster carers, how do you keep yourself informed, and how do you know when you're well informed to be able to advocate for someone?
One of the things I've discovered within fostering is that you go into meetings with professionals and they don't know what they're talking about. And they don't know what the rules are. They're kind of blagging it. So I go into meetings knowing what the rules are. So I'm the one in the room that tells them actually what the law is, what the statutory guidance is, what the regulation is. Which puts me in a position of power. And that's a really simple thing to do, actually. Get informed. That's kind of, because children do actually have certain rights. Children with care experience have certain rights. I mean, the government is attempting to water down the rights for children in care, but that kind of leaves that aside. But children do have rights, and professionals do have particular responsibilities to children who are in care. And often they don't know what their responsibilities and duties are. So for example, children who are in care, all schools have to have what's known as a designated teacher for looked after children. That's the law. And there is statutory guidance that outlines what the role of the designated teacher is. So when I go into my foster child's school and the designated teacher isn't doing what they should be doing, and they're saying, oh, I only need to do this, this, and this. And I'm like, actually, statutory guidance, blah, blah, paragraph number tells you need to do this, and you're not. So getting informed, and honestly, I think there's no excuse for not getting informed. We've got the internet now. If you know where to look for stuff, it's all on the blooming internet. But before I go into a meeting, I get informed. I've been in meetings before where there was an issue around someone who was a nurse. I don't know much about the nursing profession, but in advance of the meeting, I went and looked at the professional standards by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, so that I knew what the expectation was, so that when I went in the meeting, I started throwing that stuff around. I knew nothing about it beforehand. So I don't go to these things already as an expert. I do my preparation, I do my prep. So I go into meetings knowing what the rules are. And part of that is because of my privileged position of being in the job that I'm in. But also it's just because I actually can be asked to go and have a look at at what the rules and regulations are. And as I said, often I find myself in a situation where I'm in a meeting and I'm the only one that knows what they are. So I have to tell people. I mean, I've literally gone into meetings before with it printed off. You put that on the table, ready for your meeting, a whole bunch of policy documents there with your little thumb note things there. I mean, think about the message that sends to other professionals. They cack themselves, they just roll over and do anything you ask them to. I think being prepared, and I know that the module that we're talking about here is the informed practitioner, informed to be an advocate. I think that's a really important element. Really, is there's no excuse for not being informed, but that requires effort. Don't be one of those practitioners in the room that doesn't know what you should and shouldn't be doing, because you'll get someone like me making a fool of you.
Do you consider yourself to be a successful advocate? And if so, how do you know?
Yes and no. I mean, on the balance of things, probably more no, because, you know, I've won some battles and got some successes, but young people are still having their rights diluted. So on a wider scale, there's always work to be done, really, I think. So when it comes to kind of individual causes for my foster children, then you know it's a success when you've got what they want or what they need, or if they've not got what they want, then they've been given a sufficient explanation for why that's not been possible for them to have what they want. Because we all want things sometimes that aren't possible, don't we? So we need, when the answer's no, sometimes that's okay, but as long as it's explained to young people and made clear to them that, you know, this is the reason we can't do this. So there's a kind of a whole sort of bunch of individual stuff, but the wider fight for young people with care experience is ongoing, and I'm, you know, part of a few kind of national organisations, and not part of them, I'm kind of hanging around on their coattails essentially, who are doing some really important work. Article 39, NIAS, Become, all the 3 charities that in England are kind of doing quite a lot of stuff around advocacy for young people in care. They've got quite a lot of campaigns, so I kind of try and get involved where I can there. But the fight is still ongoing, because we just have this perception that young people are second-class citizens. And
so you kind of brought me to my last question, really, which is at what point does the role of an advocate end?
Yeah, I think it sort of depends on what the terms are, really, in a sense, because I don't know, actually. I mean, when does that end? So if I'm advocating on a particular issue, when that issue's dealt with, then I might stop advocating on that particular issue. Doesn't stop me then advocating for my foster children. When do I stop advocating for them? I don't know. Even when they leave us, I imagine I will be spending most of my time fighting for them. So I suppose, I think my advocacy journey probably ends when I die. I don't know when that'll be.
None of us do. Those are all my questions. Can I just give you the opportunity to say anything else that you don't think you've said that you'd like to say?
No, I don't think so. I think I've hopefully covered most things and given some sort of tangible examples of how advocacy works. And as I said, just to reinforce the point earlier about, you know, you do need to be informed. You need to know your business if you want to go and campaign on behalf of other people. Ill-informed campaigning and advocacy is not effective. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of everyone's time. So getting informed is really crucial.